is going live, going viral, and here's Jim Dingeman.
Well, welcome to the February 2nd edition of Going Viral, That News. My name is Jim Dingeman. I'm joined from California with Kenny Aaron, and we have out in Long Island, we have Steve Jonas. I was very happy, Steve, to see some great TV shows today on seafood out in Montauk Point. It was quite amazing to watch. And we have Michael Jankowitz here today with us, Alex Stavropoulos, and Dennis Goldstein. Playfell Benjamin is threatening to join us. We'll see if that actually happens today. But let me go through the top stories of the news today. Now, we have the Ukraine crisis still raging. We're going to spend some time on that in a few minutes, talking about the latest developments on it. We have Biden making today an announcement in the White House that he's going to try to end cancer as a course, or basically reduce the death rate of cancer. We'll see how that goes. And then you have further revelations with the U.S. Capitol attack. This weekend, Trump was in one of his speeches, and he essentially announced he would consider a blanket pardon for everybody who came and attacked the Capitol on January 6th. And he urges his followers to massively protest at every single venue where he is going to be prosecuted in the state of New York and elsewhere. So he's basically asking mobs to come and descend on the courthouses in New York City. That should be quite a show, because I will definitely go and join that to counter-protest them. In any event, we also have some news in the internet front. There is a decline in Facebook's shares. Quite interesting. Amid higher costs and a slow growth. Now, there's also been a rash in hate crimes. There are bomb threats targeting historical U.S. black colleges, and they're being investigated right now. In the media markets in the United States, Jeff Zucker has resigned over his relationship with a senior executive. That was the head of CNN, so he's gone. And we have other news today. There is a question of Omicron essentially being responsible for the poor economic numbers in the past couple of weeks. This quarter, of course, is particularly bad, although we've seen that there has been a drop in new cases in the past week, but they were overwhelmed by 9 million cases hitting them almost at once, and that did affect the economic statistics. New deaths have risen by 10%, and the fully vaccinated still remain low. We still remain lower than most of our allies around the world. And also, we're going to spend some time today talking about, I'd like to actually talk about the issue of nominating a black woman to the Supreme Court, long overdue. And I also want to talk about down the road, so stay tuned. We're going to talk about what just happened to Whoopi Goldberg on The View when she came out with a comment about the Holocaust this week, and she was suspended by ABC News. But before we do that, let me bring up some news that has to do with the Ukraine. Oh, and of course, the latest in the saga of my pal Boris Johnson in the parliament. He is still underway and being attacked even further. There's been a third letter of condemnation from the conservative side. But let's see some of the news from the Ukraine.
You're waiting for it to happen.
A barbed back and forth, seemingly without resolution.
The reality is that Russia has surrounded Ukraine with a well-armed military force, not just to Ukraine's east, but now through Belarus into Ukraine's north and down from the south, from the Black Sea.
Back in the US, the White House has been maintaining it has proof that Russia is readying itself to attack.
It's not just words, of course. You are seeing specifics that we've been laying out here, including over 100,000 troops on Ukraine's borders.
Their current plan to stop it, packages of economic sanctions on what they call Russian elites. That prevention strategy mirrored in the UK. Foreign Secretary Liz Truss saying wide-ranging sanctions are being readied.
The ball is firmly in Russia's court. While we're determined to accelerate these efforts, we do so from a position of strength. We are combining dialogue with deterrence.
Away from the war of words, war games continue on the ground, with the world watching to see if the West fears will become reality.
Steve, lead off. What do you think about where we're at with all this?
Well, I've been very puzzled by it from the beginning, but I think that one doesn't know what, I think a central question, and I don't think this is anything particularly original, but a central question is, of course, is what does Putin really want out of this? Why has he massed all these troops? Why is he, starting the surrounding of physical surrounding of Ukraine? What is his objective? And I think there've been a lot of guesses about that. I think nobody knows. I think one of the main guesses is, at least my main guess and others, is that he is not going to physically invade Ukraine. I mean, that could be almost suicidal in the end for Russia. But I think an important historical factor, which is very infrequently mentioned but is important, is that what's called the Minsk II agreement that was arrived at, I believe, in 2016 by Ukraine, Russia, and a group of European powers and the United States, which, if it had been implemented then, would have maybe not brought the conflict to an end, but at least would have calmed it down, has never been implemented. And it included things, for example, the major demands of Russian speakers living in the east of Ukraine is that they be granted a significant degree of local autonomy. That was built into the Minsk II. Also, that Russian would be the primary language in that region. I said pointed out last week, that the Ukrainian fascists, otherwise known as the Azov battalion, descended from the unit which fought alongside the Wehrmacht in World War II, wanted to wipe out the Russian language throughout Ukraine, and not even recognize Russian as a second language in those two eastern provinces. But the key point here is, and maybe other people on the panel can speak to it, Ukraine is the only principal party to Minsk II which has not agreed to implement it. And that's something that I've seen it once or twice, but it's something that does not appear frequently in the Western media, and I think that's very important. In the, whether you want to call it propaganda or in the news, whatever, about this situation, everything is pointed at the Russians and Putin and the 100,000 troops, and they keep adding more. But nobody discusses this particular point. That Ukraine has refused to implement Minsk II. One of the point that I would make is that, compared with the period about which Alex knows a great deal of fighting in this region, which occurred during the Napoleonic Wars, getting intelligence about what was going on the other side of the line was very difficult in those days, right, Alex? Alex? Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, of course. No, everything was.
Today,
the distance was by horseback.
With the satellites, I mean, you could almost see when Russian troops are, going to the head. I mean, it's just. It's just right. Amazing. There don't seem to be any.
There's a big crisis in, I think it's 1790, where the British consider, it's when Catherine the Great is fighting with the Turks and she's winning. It's called this Ochagov crisis, I think, and the British are considering intervening, through the Black Sea
Right.
to save, I think it was the Emirate of Crimea was also being fighting, and the Ottomans, to keep the Russians from expanding back then. And the British essentially eventually concluded, well, they just couldn't project power into that area. They had the Royal Navy, sure, it was, greatest in the world, but the idea of British troops landing, in the Ukraine, and they'll literally be swallowed up by, the Tsar had like 400, well, Tsarina at that point had 400,000 troops. So they would have been swallowed up and spit out if they were actually to try and fight.
But of
So,
course,
and I think some of those apply to NATO now.
Yeah, but as you know well, 65 years later, there were a significant number of British troops landed in that.
But remember, they had the French
too, and French too. Interestingly enough,
and the Austrians were supporting them at the time.
The who?
Though not directly. The Austro-Hungarian Empire were supporting them, though they were a threat. They didn't directly intervene, but the Russians had to keep an eye on their direction, which is one reason why, the Crimean War wound up being a Anglo-French victory.
Yeah, but it was despite the charge of the Light Brigade, they still. But in support of the Turks against the Russians again in 1855. So that's a little diversion from between the two folks on this broadcast who are particularly interested in these details of history. But I don't have anything magical to add. Oh, yeah, one more point. I think I had seen this earlier, but I had forgotten it. Last week, I mentioned the name of Victoria Nuland, who was the Assistant Secretary of State, I think, for European Affairs in 2014, at the time that the pro-Russian government in Kiev was overthrown. And there's that famous recording. I don't know how anybody got it, but she was talking to one of our allies in NATO or in the European Union, celebrating the victory of the pro-Western forces. Like, we did it, and the implication was that the United States, in one way or another, was involved in supporting this revolution. Victoria Nuland is now, I think, the Undersecretary of State in the Biden government. This is, personalities do have a role to play in history.
Okay, Jim, what'd you bring up?
Well, Nuland, of course, was married to Mr. Kagan, one of the Kagan family of Yale University, Fred Kagan's son. And that's her husband.
You mean not
Robert Kagan.
Don Kagan's the dad. It's Fred and Robert are the sons. And
Robert. She's married to Robert.
He's the one who wrote that book of the Europeans are Venus and the U.S. is Mars, or whatever that book.
Right. Yeah. Well, this is the Minsk Agreement. I'm showing right here the Minsk I Agreement, and what it was set up to do was. Basically, as you can see, these are the buffer lines between the separatists in Luhansk and Donetsk. And then these are the lines of the Ukrainians right here. And what there, as you can see, basically both sides have violated this. As you can see, they set it up with 15-kilometer buffer zones where artillery is not supposed to be deployed on both sides. And that has been violated by both sides. Both sides had this, the whole thing has broke down rather rapidly. And here is the line of the Ukrainians here. Now, when the fighting started in 2014, after the Euromaidan revolt, the calculation of the Russians was that they could probably topple the regime that was installed as a result of the revolution pretty quickly, because at that time they only had 6,000 troops out of 150,000 considered combat ready. the Ukrainians.
Wow.
So what occurred was there was indeed this mass mobilization to come up and fight, in this area here where I'm pointing out. And the fighting went back and forth throughout the summer of 2014. And the Minsk I protocol was set up, I believe, in September of 2014. Minsk II was in 2015. And the interesting thing about that is that the Minsk II, and here are some of the provisions of the Minsk I protocol. Both sides were to have a ceasefire. Monitoring and verification of the ceasefire was to be done by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. They were to decentralize power, and that's where you get into this issue of local self-governments of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. Those are the oblasts that separated and basically revolted against the Ukrainian regime. There would be permanent mounting, monitoring, basically, let's have dialogue between the two sides and withdraw illegal armed groups and military equipment. That completely broke down. And fighters and mercenaries from the territory of Ukraine be withdrawn and out of those buffer zones. That broke down too. Both sides, I should add, were responsible for that breakdown. And so they continue to have violations. Here, September 2014, they signed the Minsk Protocol. That goes on, and then there's a fighting here. Now, the importance of this is that this airport, Donetsk Airport, was a scene of great combat. There was the Ukrainians even made a documentary about it. But by that point in time, there were the involvement of large-scale elements of the Russian army. You see this term, battalion tactical groups. The Russians sent about 30 battalion tactical groups to support the separatists who were having a hard time. At one point, the Ukrainians concentrated most of their forces up here on the north, basically north of Luhansk, and their objective was to attack southwards to cut off the troops that were fighting in the front. In one particular, they had a 120 kilometer raid through all this area of Luhansk and Donetsk, in which when the fighting then was frozen, these troops were still behind the lines of the separatists. Now, then you go back to Minsk II. What the hell? I'm having a problem pronouncing that damn word. Now, that occurs in January 2015. By then, the entire first ceasefire had broken down. That I showed you that airport they'd captured. And then there was fighting. The French under Francois Hollande and Angela Merkel got involved. That's where you see the present involvement of France and Germany in this peace process right now. They call that the Normandy format. They basically went off Russia, Ukraine, France, and Germany, set up, after this failed, they set up another formula they call the Normandy format. But here are some of the criticisms. There was not enough tripwires. They didn't demarcate control over one of the cities. I'll show that in a minute, Debaltseve. And then you had this EU summit with Hollande, Poroshenko, and Chancellor Merkel set up in Brussels. And so, and at that point, there was still this intensive fighting going around Debaltseve. And I'm going to show you that in a moment. So here's the second agreement they come up with. That there would be immediate ceasefire in Donetsk and Luhansk, that they would pull out the weapons of both sides to equal distance and create a security zone, actually bigger, 31 kilometers apart, 50 kilometers apart, for the artillery and also the multiple rocket launchers, the MRLSs. They were very concerned about this because the Russians sent in these very well-equipped rocket launcher units. And at one point, they destroyed 2 battalions of Ukrainian troops in like 10 minutes with hitting them with basically napalm equipped missiles. They wanted these armed formations of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblasts to pull out from the contact line, and this all broke down again. Now, this is where Putin has made a big deal. He says, well, the Ukrainians are responsible for this breakdown. I would argue both sides are responsible for it, as I can see trying to understand this. And someone said to me earlier today, and this is a big fight, as you can imagine. I was talking to Playfellow about this, and he said, well, how would the United States tolerate if a Marxist-Leninist government was in Canada and the Russians start sending troops to train the Canadians to fight against us? How would we react? Or suppose they threaten to send missiles to Canada to shoot at us. As you know, Putin has said if they send hypersonic missiles, that will be a red line to cross. So again, and that's a good point to make. So anyway, let me bring Alex in on this. Alex, your comments about all this going on.
Well, one thing I don't think we've talked about yet is, well, something I was thinking about today, is Biden's domestic reasons to do this, which is this, of course, is a great distraction from the fact that the failure of his policies and the fact that, he's accomplished, very little. Nobody's talking about high inflation, which is happening. Nobody's talking, again, his failure to pass Build Back Better. I know he may want people to talk about the new Supreme Court justice, or maybe actually he doesn't want to, because obviously that's going to be a contentious thing, and I'm sure the Republicans are going to make a big deal about whoever he nominates and how, they're going to force their kids to, turn gay or something. But, and the interesting thing is the way the Republicans are responding to this is to say, well, Biden isn't being tough enough on Putin, which to some extent kind of reinforces the distraction from, of course, I haven't seen the latest polling, and I'm not sure, especially this far out from the actual election, which is going to be in November, whether it does much, unless there's actually a war or invasion, what political benefit it'll have for Biden, again, except, distracting people from the bad stuff. But if there isn't good stuff happening, I don't think it's going to help him, win the congressional races in November. But I think for now, that's a big part of, certainly why there's so much hype, especially again, and from pro-democratic media, MSNBC, the usual suspects.
All right. Well, I'll tell you what the opinion polls saw. They basically say that there is a real fright in Russia. 80% of Russian opinion feel there's a definite chance that there could be a war. In the United States, it's split. And surprisingly, there's bipartisan cooperation on some of these things. But it's only about 30% of Americans think we should militarily involve ourselves in this situation. Most Americans are indifferent and opposed to an intervention into the Ukraine. And we're sort of seeing that with what's going on. But let's bring Dennis in. Dennis, can you unmute and give us your opinions about where we're at with this stuff? Dennis? And while you're doing that, yes, go on, Dennis. Yeah, we can hear you, Dennis. Go on.
Okay. I would say the United States is definitely the aggressor nation. What they're doing is, I would say, saber rattling. And the military-industrial complex wants this. They want I don't know if they want a war per se, but they definitely want the threat of war to around. And I would say that we have to do something about the military-industrial complex running foreign policy in the United States, period. If we don't do something about it, they will be the ruin of us. That's how I look at it.
Yeah, it's interesting because I got emails today about demonstrations to be organized down in Times Square on Friday. And then people, I was reading a book in the subway called Covert Operations Against the Kremlin. So all of a sudden, all these guys start saying to me, well, do you think a war's going to break out? And I sort of didn't say much. I said, well, I want to know what you think. And most people were saying no. They didn't think a war would break out. Now, remember, in 1914, people didn't think that war would break out in Sarajevo. So, it's always a thing to keep in mind. Now, Kenny, what do you think about all this?
I think we should do a poll right here, the people here. Forget about those other polls. Those are just, people that ask leading questions. Like, if it was Tuesday and you just came back from dinner, would you support the U.S.? You never know what they do to try and push it. So I was just making up a survey, but let's just go around and get a single answer, yes or no. Should the U.S. support Ukraine if it's invaded by Russia? Whatever that means, broad scope. Should the U.S. support it? And that's got too fancy. I say no. Let's go, Steve. Alex, unmute.
Yeah.
Steve.
No.
It would.
What? You said no.
No.
Okay, Alex?
It would depend on the circumstances of how the war.
No. But yes or no? Get off the pot. Come on.
Okay.
Yes or no?
No, it's
thank
not.
you.
I'm a diplomatic historian. I don't give yes or no
Right.
answers on that kind of question.
Oh, you don't want to answer. Okay. He abstains. He's a Democrat. Okay. He doesn't want to upset anybody. All right. Jim, to support Ukraine or not? Yes or no? Come on.
I don't want to see World War III break out, but so I'm going to be hemming and hawing like Alex just did.
Yeah.
And as they say at the Pacifica National Board, I pass. Let Michael.
Yeah. Okay, Michael. Your vote.
I'll wait until it's my turn to speak, and then I'll explain.
Okay. Oh, you want to explain your vote? Well, just vote, and then you can go right into explaining it.
Ken.
Michael has had a chance.
I'm going to speak, and then after I'm done, you can ask me the question.
Oh, I see. Okay. Go ahead. Speak.
No, it's still your turn, Ken.
No. I don't have anything to say. I voted. I said what I think is we should vote on it.
You just want to have a vote?
That's it. We've been chewing on this for a couple of days or a week.
Yeah,
they've been fighting. It's all got started under Barack Obama. And,
All right. Well, let me start off with a couple of things. First of all, I watched a lot of the exchange between the that happened in the UN. Personally, my opinion is that the U.S. ambassador made mincemeat of the Russian ambassador, because the Russian ambassador was saying things like, no, we're not doing, the United States and Ukraine and the West is doing is provoking this. We're not provoking it. And the U.S. ambassador basically said, oh, sure, putting 130,000 troops on the border is not a provocation. So it was I thought it was a little embarrassing for the Russians. They did not handle it well. But that being said, supposedly there is a move that the United States may, as it was described in one article, be throwing a bone to Russia, the United States and the West, and possibly Ukraine, which is to say that they would be willing to guarantee, if this comes to pass, they would be willing to possibly guarantee that no cruise missiles would be employed on any NATO countries bordering Russia. So they would either remove those that are there or not deploy any there. So if that happens, that means no deep penetration missile strikes inside Russia. So if this is really a security, an issue that where Russia's worrying about its well-being, that should mollify them to some extent on that. But we don't know because, as far as I know, that I don't even know if that's even been put out. Might have been in secret to the Russians, but we certainly don't have a Russian response to it anyway at this point. So if that's the case, if that's put out there, then we'll see how that affects things, because that may also affect the calculation as far as NATO, who gets into NATO. Basically, that would be guaranteeing Russia's security to some extent from any countries on its border. That being said, I also think that we're very worried. I know everybody wants to make this all about the United States because, let's face it, to Americans, the whole world revolves around America. But the stars of this show are Russia and the Ukraine. Okay, yes, there is an undue amount of influence being put on by the United States as well as Great Britain, and some other European powers and possibly NATO. But the fact of the matter is, if we're, for instance, worrying about the domestic issues, I think we should be more focused on the domestic issues within Russia and possibly within Ukraine, more so than the United States.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Thank you.
And Ken,
yeah, what's the answer?
From doing your poll, I'm not finished, and I will not answer your question.
Oh, okay, but give me a time limit. How long before you finish?
Let me see. How old are you?
5 years older than you. How long before you finish?
You'll still be alive. Don't worry. So the idea is that when all these issues come to pass, at that point, as far as giving, should the United States support it? Let me just say, Ken, and this is in fairness to Alex and Jim and everything like that, and people like that, is when you pose a question, sometimes it's not a yes or no question. I would say should the United States become directly involved, and should we escalate into what would essentially be a world war? No. But should the United States support Ukraine? Possibly. Yeah. Should they give support to them? I mean, we have been giving support. Should we give more support? Yeah, I think that may be a possibility.
Okay, great. And the only one who didn't answer yet is Dennis.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead. Okay. Should the U.S. get involved if Russia invades the Ukraine?
The U.S. has stirred up the whole issue to begin with. Mm-hmm. So it's the U.S., the neocons that are running the U.S. foreign policy in favor of military. I would say we should not have war. The U.S. should back out of the whole situation and get out of the way and stop it. Because the Russians don't want war, the Ukrainians don't want war. Zelensky has already told Biden to lower the tone of military, just to back off. That's what he told him. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, we got 4 no, 2 abstain, and 1 yes. Maybe that's more than the people we have. So maybe it's 3 no.
Ken.
Yeah.
Let me reiterate.
Yeah,
my yes was a qualified yes.
Yeah, I understand.
Qualified no's. And next time, come up with a better question.
Well, let me ask you: are you married? Sometimes you have to say
3 women. What do you mean? Am I married? If I were
sometimes
married,
you have to say yes or no.
Well, you know something. That's probably why I'm not married.
Okay.
God knows some of my ex-girlfriends. I never had to do that with my ex-girlfriends, but then again, they're my ex-girlfriends.
Right.
No, actually, Ken, it's the nature of your question, because you're asking, should we support them? And Alex made a good point. He said, how? I mean, in essence, depends upon what type of support you're talking about.
Uh-huh.
So I would say, when you ask a question, be specific. If you want an unqualified answer, you have to give a more qualified.
Okay, very qualified. Russia goes in, starts killing Ukrainians, soldiers, takes over control of cities. They invade Ukraine. They capture Kiev. Whether they do it on the first day or the 10th day. Should the U.S. get involved?
The U.S. is already involved.
Right.
Okay,
right.
So let's start from that premise.
Yeah.
The question of the U.S. getting involved in a all-out invasion, first of all, I'm more and more. There was someone today announced that there was a stand down of the Russians. So I'm saying to myself, so Putin is basically deploying all this military force. He's playing chicken.
Right.
And he wants to gain his diplomatic aims. Because if you look at it objectively, there's nothing, there may be some plus things to launch a military operation, but then there are a lot of negative things about launching a military operation, look at how he's benefiting from the rise of gas prices.
Right.
I mean, his economy is dependent on exporting gas, and he has 56% of the gas that goes into Germany comes from Russia. So why would he want to disrupt that? And if you look at the kind of splits going on in NATO or the European countries, Orbán, this is one of the craziest things. Orbán is in Moscow, Orbán of Hungary. But then Orbán is someone that Tucker Carlson loves. What a strange bunch of bedfellows.
Because they're sort of really they're ultra-nationalists.
Right. And then their question of the splits within the German domestic politic, the Green Party, is sort of going along with, like, let's confront Russia. And then you have Macron sort of arguing, and again, I think Alex would be more familiar with the domestic politics in France. They're going back and forth about this issue. I mean, and then of course you got good old Boris decided to fly in after he'd been roasted the day before by Parliament over Partygate. Decides to do a little fly into Kyiv and fly out, and he's actually, I believe, he's promised to send British advisors now. So. It's interesting to see how they're all making these little haze out of this. But let me move into the next topic, which I'd want to talk about, which is a domestic one. And that is, I'm sort of curious to hear what people have to think about Whoopi Goldberg being suspended off The View for her comments about the Holocaust. And I don't know if you're familiar with, are you familiar with this, Steve? What happened?
You got to mute, Steve.
You got to unmute. Well, as we're talking about it,
here we go.
Are you familiar with this whole kerfluffle?
Yes, I am. I'm somewhat familiar with it, and but I think it's an offshoot, and unfortunate for Whoopi Goldberg. But I've never liked her name, so I don't know what her real name is. But Goldberg has some very important historical connotations. But anyway, there have been a lot of rightists and some leftists too. I don't know how many of you see the left anti-vax literature. I see it on a regular basis. I stopped responding to it several weeks ago because it's a bloody waste of time. But who have compared, certainly the rightists and some of the leftists have compared what is misnamed mandatory vaccination. It's not mandatory vaccination. Nobody in this country can be forced to be vaccinated. You can be required to be vaccinated to engage in certain kinds of activities, whether it's going to school, going to work, whatever. But I think the word mandate was a very unfortunate choice. I wrote at length about that in my most recent column. What I also wrote about was that anybody, whether it's a right winger, whether it's beyond the right, which is Tucker Carlson, or it's Whoopi Goldberg, who compares. Even if you want to use the word mandated vaccination to the Holocaust, just is totally revealing that they know nothing about the Holocaust. Absolutely nothing. The Holocaust was a planned operation. There's a famous event that took place on January 20th, 1942, called the Bonsai Conference. It was on the Von, W-A-N-N-S-E, Wannsee, the Lake Von, south of Berlin, in a very elegant building that is now a museum. I had I can't say pleasure, but certainly privilege of visiting it in 2007. This was an industrial operation. There's one set of minutes that was somehow miraculously maintain, which shows, I mean, the Germans went about this. The word had come through Reinhard Heydrich from Hitler that the final solution to the Jewish problem was to be killing them all. And that message was clearly transmitted. And then these, I think it was 21 men sat around a table for, it only took them an hour and a half to figure out how they were going to do this. And it ended up at Auschwitz, which I had also visited a couple of years before I visited the site of the Bonsai Conference. This was industrial destruction of people, when you know the Bonsai Conference is not well known, but of course what happened specifically at Auschwitz is very well known. There have been a number of movies. Spielberg made a movie. Actually, there was a very interesting movie about the Bonsai Conference that was made that certainly didn't get the play that Spielberg's movie about Auschwitz did. But they know nothing. Right. They know absolutely nothing about the Holocaust. Right. And so that's how I completely dispose of the argument. Whoopi Goldberg just illustrated that, you know, she's apparently, I'm not a big fan of hers, but she's apparently a very intelligent woman. And she just revealed that on this particular question, she knows nothing.
All right, let me play what the BBC had to say about this. This is the BBC today.
Goldberg is facing a backlash after she said the Holocaust was not about race. She made the comments on a U.S. talk show, The View, which was discussing a decision by a school board in Tennessee to ban the award-winning graphic Holocaust novel, Moss. The school board said it banned the book because its profanity, nudity, and depiction of suicide was inappropriate for 13-year-olds. Goldberg told her co-hosts, if you're going to do this, then let's just be truthful about it, because the Holocaust isn't about race. No, it's not about race. Co-host Joy Behar pointed out that the Nazis said the Jews were a different race. She then said, but it's not about race. It's not. It's about man's inhumanity to other man. Whoopi's co-host Anna Navarro responded, but it's about white supremacy. It's about going after Jews and Gypsies and Roma. Whoopi Goldberg then said, but these are two white groups of people, and co-host Sarah Haynes pointed out that the Nazis didn't see them as white. Then Whoopi added, but you're missing the point. The minute you turn it into race, it goes down this alley. Let's talk about what it is for what it is. It's how people treat each other. It's a problem. The actress has since apologized. Well, with me is our entertainment correspondent, Lisa Mzumba. Lisa, it sounds like a bit of a mess.
Yes, of course, what Whoopi Goldberg says matters. She was talking on The View, a talk show in the States that airs every single weekday. They discuss all sorts of different issues surrounding the nation and across the globe. And of course, she's seen as somebody who's a prominent woman, a prominent black woman, one of the only black women, for instance, to win an acting Oscar. Now, what she didn't do yesterday, she didn't deny the scale or the horror of the Holocaust in, say, terms of numbers. But as you just pointed out, what she did do was say that it wasn't about race. She said it was about, two groups of white people and one's treatment of the other. Now, that's more than an oversimplification. That actually is inaccurate. It diminishes the experience of the Holocaust, as so many people pointed out who were both upset and offended by what she says. The Anti-Defamation League, Jonathan Greenblatt, said, the Holocaust was about the Nazis' systematic annihilation of the Jewish people, who they deemed to be an inferior race. So the way that she separated race from the actual experience of the Holocaust was deemed by so many to be upsetting and basically wrong. The Holocaust Museum tweeted out yesterday in what's been widely interpreted as a response to what she said. Racism was central to Nazi ideology. Jews weren't defined by religion, but by race. Nazi racist beliefs fueled genocide and mass murder. Now, as you say, Whoopi Goldberg, since she made those comments, has now apologized. She said on today's show, I said the Holocaust is not about race, but about man's inhumanity to man. I should have said it's about both. The Jewish people around the world have always had my support, and that will never waver. I'm sorry for the hurt I have caused. So that has been accepted by many as an apology for what she said yesterday, because, as I said, she wasn't trying to diminish in terms of scale what the Holocaust happened, but it's the Holocaust. It's always so important to remember the causes of the Holocaust, why the Nazis behaved as they did so unforgivably. And what Whoopi Goldberg said yesterday was seen by many to chip away at that at a time when around the world anti-Semitism is still, such a big, important issue to be dealt with.
Yeah, very much so. It just all felt quite clumsy. Her explanations, her attempts at rectifying what she was saying, just felt quite clumsy.
It did, but she's come back and said, I'm sorry, I was wrong. And I think that will be seen by many people as the main thing. Of course, lots of people out there should have said that somebody of her prominence and intelligence should never have said something like that in the first place to such a wide audience, and those comments have been repeated and amplified throughout the world. And of course, what she said previously on the show before she apologized, it does give amplification. It does give support to some people who like to diminish anti-Semitism as a form of not racism, but as a form of racial intolerance, which again is really diminishing what anti-Semitism is all about. And so to try and counter that, they thought it was important, and so many groups have spoken out, pointing out exactly why she was wrong about what she said. And I think they will, at least on the very basic level, they wish she'd never said it in the first place, but at least she has apologised and not try to fudge it absolutely and say, what, you misunderstood what I was trying to say, or, I was, she's basically said, I was wrong. I should have said it was about race when I didn't, and I was wrong in that.
Lisa, thank you very much for bringing us up.
All right, so basically,
could I just add very briefly, very briefly to my remarks, and that is that Whoopi Goldberg, very understandably, for Whoopi, and this also is part of, she doesn't know what the Holocaust was about, but for Whoopi Goldberg, the words race and racism in the United States apply specifically to Black people. And they, as 1619 has very correctly pointed out, they've been a central element of American politics, economics, and culture since the first slaves were sold in South Carolina. So that it's very understandable that Whoopi Goldberg sees that that's what race means. For the Nazis and in many people in Europe, it wasn't just the Nazis. Anti-Semitism flourished, for example, in Hungary between the wars, which is one of the reasons, there's a historical continuity leading from Miklos Horthy, the first fascist dictator, to Orban, but that's beside the point. The thing is that the Nazis indeed saw the Jews as a different race. It didn't matter that the skin color was the same. What mattered was that they were Untermenschen. They were below people. They were a different race. And of course, that also applied to the Roma. So that it was racism in the European sense. And of course, anti-Semitism in Europe goes back to the 5th century when St. Augustine codified anti-Semitism that existed, on and off in different ways over the first 5 centuries following the death of Christ and the beginning of Christianity, when he codified it to say that the Jews, he codified that the Jews killed Christ, and that modern anti-Semitism started from that point. But just I said I was going to be short. I'm sorry, I'm not exactly, but it's very, very important to understand that the Nazis viewed the Jews as a different race and a diminished race, an inferior race, Untermenschen, below people.
well, I want to add that what Whoopi said sort of is interesting to me also from the grounds of how the Nazis viewed Africans, because Africans were viewed, there are several, I did a documentary about this a long time ago.
Oh, wow.
And the issue of how they viewed Africans was that, for example, the aesthetics of National Socialism essentially blamed modern art on the Jewish imitation of primitive art forms from Africa. So they would sit there, and when they decided degenerate art, or you remember there was that famous exhibit after Hitler took power on degenerate art. And what they considered degenerate art was art that, was influenced by the discoveries of the late 19th century and early 20th century of, quote, primitive art, end quote, in Africa, Polynesia, around the world that the imperial powers were bringing in. So they, for example, they would analyze Picasso as essentially using African degenerate art in particularly his famous painting of the dames in Avignon, the dames descending the you can imagine it, the walking down the it's in his blue period. So that's one thing about it. Another thing about it was that they considered the introduction of jazz into Europe after World War II as an example, World War I, as an example of basically introducing by Jewish control African music to basically pollute the minds of Europeans with the rhythms of inferior peoples, i.e. African peoples. Another aspect of this is when the French occupied different parts of Germany in response to the Germans not paying reparations after Versailles. So, for example, when they occupied the Tsar from 1921 to 1919 to 1921, there were a whole bunch of kids that were born that were spawned by French African troops.
Yeah, but some Americans too, right, Jim?
Well, they were Americans, but the main thing they blamed, so there's a whole category of kids that were of mixed race who were among the first victims of Nazism. They were shunted off and sent off as mentally defective children. A very powerful story I heard from a Black veteran who was in Europe in the spring of 1945 was he came across a Black German mixed race soldier in the Volkssturm. You can imagine how that went over with the Nazis, to have a Black soldier who was considered, and I was stunned to hear this story, because I said, well, wait a second, I didn't know that. And he actually came across a family. The mother showed the picture of her mixed race kid in a German uniform. And so there's a lot to be said that Whoopi's not familiar with in any of this. The theory, the Nazis were very explicit about their panoply of races that were inferior, that had to be dominated. And of course, they wanted to control Africa as a colony. They had, and then of course it intermingled with their attitude towards Slavic people. When they initiated Operation Barbarossa, they had a pre-plan to starve 40 million people, because they felt that should be enough. That should allow the Ukrainian wheat to be supplied to the home front to keep domestic peace. So it's fascinating. These kind of things Whoopi's obviously not aware of, or else she wouldn't have made a stupid comment like that. But Alex, your comments.
Let me just intercept before, Alex. Fascinating that you began your talk talking about the degenerative art exhibition in Berlin that was then reproduced at the Neue Galerie in New York in 2014. This book is from, it's sitting on the table where the computer is in the museum.
Hold it up so I can see
so
the
we see
bottom.
the
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay. It says okay. Never number. Okay.
And we should add that Hermann Goring used to buy all that stuff. Anyway, Alex, go on.
Right, yeah, but well, again, you took one of the points I was going to make, which again is to bring, of course, again, Slavs were also considered, inferior race, but also remember Hitler, in terms of the United States, one of the reasons he thought the U.S. declaring war on the U.S. wouldn't be much of an issue is because of his overall racial ideological belief that because the U.S. was a mixed race country, that it was weak, degenerate, and so on, and couldn't basically fight then. So it was not, to him, it was like, well, they're degenerate people. It doesn't matter if I declare war on them, they're not going to contribute all that much to beating me, and I'll win anyway.
Wow.
So yeah. So again, race is key. I mean, you read about any part of the Nazi Empire, of their imperial their, and of course the Holocaust. It's not just the Holocaust, but their military actions have a lot to attitudes have a lot to do with race.
Well, Hitler loved watching Hollywood movies, and so he loved
watching
he liked Grapes of Wrath. So he thought that was what America was like. All these guys, migrating back and forth in trucks as a result of the Depression. So that's one of the many reasons why it went into his mindset to think that we wouldn't fight.
Right, and he had this idea that he loved Western novels.
Well, that goes back to Karl
idea
May.
That he was going to do that in Eastern Europe. Basically, he was going to do what we did to the Native Americans, essentially.
Well, but that was Karl May. That was Karl May's novels. That's a whole other topic to talk about. And actually, the East Germans made movies about Karl May. It was sort of amusing that they did in their filmography that. But let's bring Dennis in. Dennis, what's your comments about Whoopi Goldberg and all this fuss about her?
It's ridiculous.
Dennis? Yeah, go on.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Dennis.
Yeah. I don't care what Whoopi Goldberg has to say. And therefore, it's not a big deal to me what she says one way or the other. I think a lot of people just spout off, whatever. She's confused, period.
All right. Thank you. And I should add that I have to say that in terms of Pacifica, I've been arguing for years that Pacifica should devote special programming on International Remembrance Day, which is January 27th. And that is a day when Auschwitz was liberated by the Red Army. They never do it. So anyway, Mike, your comments. Mike?
All right. Yeah. First of all, let me make one thing clear. The Nazi, in other words, they persecuted a lot of other people. They enslaved a lot of other people. They saw other races as inferior race. Certainly more so, other than the Jews, people who were black, African, who were just black or dark skinned. That was obviously they were racist against that. But in particular, they sought to wipe the Jewish race off the face of the earth, at least the face of the earth that they had any control over. The group, except to some extent, he did have plans to wipe out as many black people as possible. But he did, first and foremost, he wanted to wipe the Jewish race off the face of the earth. Something else also. Jews were not, Whoopi Goldberg's problem is that she made that comment. She made it a stupid remark, especially in show business. But the idea is she decided to go further with it and said, well, it was really white people, implied that it was white people on white people. No, it wasn't white people. It wasn't even one white race against another one. Jews weren't considered white. And if you look into it a little more carefully, you'll find out that, and some of you probably know this, that up until nearly the beginning of World War II, Jews were not considered white in the United States. In most countries in the world, Jews were not considered white. Jews being considered white is a recent phenomenon, and it's still not even as widespread as people think. Jews are not universally considered white. So the fact is that this was most obviously, it was, one of the most racist events in human history, especially considering the scale and the extreme of it. But so Whoopi Goldberg, no, she didn't know what she was talking about, but she probably should have just let the first remark go instead of trying to double down on it. And that's where the problem arises. As far as the but as far as remarks like this, again, people in show business, it's like when they asked Spencer Tracy once about what did he think about actors getting involved in politics. His answer was, just remember who shot Lincoln. The idea is that we may be making more of it than it is. We tend to make, especially in this country, more out of what celebrities who are not really, who do not need to be well versed. Some of them are, but do not need to be well versed in these kind of topics because they're performers. And she's to a certain extent a writer as well. But the fact of the matter is, she just didn't know what she was talking about. Okay, so finally she apologized after making a couple of other dumb remarks. But the fact is, what it should tell us, it should be a signal for us if we want to use celebrities for some useful purpose. It should be a signal to us that we have basically a very simplistic view of what race is, especially in this country. Okay, yeah, it is obviously in this country, racism against African Americans was the most pervasive and the most injurious of all. But it's not the only form of racism. There was racism against Jews who are not considered white, racism against Asians, against Arab Americans, against you name it. In the mid 1800s, against the Irish. The Irish weren't considered white when they first came over.
All right.
So the fact is that it is racism, and we have to, instead of one oppressed group fighting another oppressed group to see whose racism is worse, people should be more, in my opinion, this is a very basic fundamental idea, that people should be saying, hey, we're all racist against, let's be against racism. Let's get rid of racism, wherever it is.
All right. Well, anyway,
One quick comment, if I could, about anti-Semitism in this country in the 1930s. It was rampant. It was at the center of the America First movement, which was led not only by Lindbergh, but also by Henry Ford, who was a very close friend of Hitler's. And in fact, they exchanged articles. The Völkischer Beobachter, which was one of the Nazi newspapers, published articles by Henry Ford, and Henry Ford in his newspapers published articles by Hitler. And we all know about Father Coughlin. People may be less familiar with Gerald L.K. Smith, but anti-Semitism was absolutely rampant, and it was
We know about all of them, Steve. Don't worry.
Huh?
We know about all of them.
Talking about the listeners out there, Mike.
Oh, okay. All
Yeah.
right. Forgot about them. Sorry, guys.
What shut up, and of course there was the German American Bund. I mean, there's been the famous rally that took place in Square Garden with the Nazi signature, with the swastikas all over the place. The marches, they were centered in Yorktown and the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and that did not end until December 8th, really, 1941. That's when America first got shut up, but it was very active until then, even as the war in Europe and in Asia, which had been started by the Japanese in 1931, was underway.
Right. Well, they, of course, acted up after Pearl Harbor, which we intend to deal with. And public opinion before Pearl Harbor was indeed, they didn't give a shit about Jews in Europe. If you look at public opinion polls, it was an abrupt shift. And even during the war itself, FDR was very careful not to interject the whole question to leave the impression that we're fighting the war to liberate Jews in Europe. As you know, there's a huge debate about how that was played out throughout the war. And there's all sorts of political opinions about it. I know I would have encounters. I'd go to conferences that were formed with very, I'd say, revisionist, and I mean revisionist in the sense of Jabotinsky type views towards understanding the Holocaust. But anyway, Kenny,
Yeah.
Ken Aaron.
Yeah. Hi.
Let's get you in there. Now, Kenny, you got some stories to share, and what's your opinion about this whole issue?
No. I already signed a contract with my editor. I can't give those stories out.
Okay.
But I wanted to ask a question of Steve, and then I'll tell you something you guys apparently don't know. Steve, during World War II on December 8th, did the U.S. make any effort to incarcerate or confine German citizens or Bund members like they did with the Japanese?
Not only did they not, did the United States not incarcerate any Germans or Italians, because we were at war.
Well, Italians, come on. You gotta eat.
We were at war with Italy. But interestingly enough, did not incarcerate any Japanese on the east coast of the United States, and there were some, but there were lots of Japanese in the Hawaiian Islands, which were the first part of the United States, which was in the war. They didn't. They weren't incarcerated there either. It was entirely political. There was a lot of anti-Japanese prejudice in the state of California. One of the principal spokesmen for that was the governor of California at the time. You may have heard of him. His name was Earl Warren.
Oh, Earl
and
Warren.
He was one of the leaders of the movement to lock up the Japanese. I would just like to make one more comment.
Well, Steve, before you make your last point, let me just give you a corrective there. Italian Americans and German Americans were incarcerated during the war, but not nearly on the scale as Japanese Americans.
Really, I did. Where was that?
There were a couple of camps. I know somebody, a friend of mine,
some were interned.
was incarcerated. They were Italian Americans, and some German Americans. But then it was based on suspicion or what political groups they had belonged to. There wasn't the, shall we say, racially based incarceration of Japanese Americans.
Yeah.
Wasn't the same.
Yeah, but I would also like to, about what was going on, or not going on with American policy towards the Jews in Europe. My father, who worked for the American Jewish Committee, and in fact, he set up the International Department of the American Jewish Committee in 1938. He was part of the group of American Jews that vainly, over and over again, tried to persuade the anti-Semitic Arabists in the State Department to start preparing to do something about the massive Jewish refugees in Europe, and were totally unsuccessful. So I know something about that whole thing personally.
Right. They did indeed incarcerate about 11,000 German Americans and about 3,000 to 4,000 Italian Americans. And these guys were folks that were definitely associated and considered, because the FBI began investigating this situation well before the war broke out. So they had lists of people, and I should say they also had communists that they were going to incarcerate at the same time. But this began in 1935. So this is, so yes, indeed, the people, and you're right about Hawaii. Hawaii, of course, was where they couldn't afford to do that on Hawaii because the labor force was so, there actually were more instances of Japanese Americans collaborating with the Japanese Empire, if you will, on Hawaii than there were on the mainland. But then the National Guard in Hawaii had large contingents of Japanese Americans who loyally responded to the attack on Pearl Harbor. My father was there, so he told me this. Anyway,
fascinating.
Jim, can I
Kenny.
add a piece of news?
Yeah, okay. I just want to let you know, Whoopi Goldberg has a net worth of $45 million. She makes somewhere between $5 to $7 million a year for being on The View. She defended Bill Cosby.
Right.
And she also defended Rick Jones, or this is a guy who's in jail now for pedophiles. And she defended him hitting women. So, I don't care. But the other thing is this. Wait a minute. She's been suspended for 2 weeks. Now, this whole cancel culture thing of like, you said a naughty word. You said something they didn't like. I saw you putting your finger in your nose. This is ridiculous.
Well,
And you can't live in a
Ken.
country where somebody makes a statement like, I
Ken.
think that guy's an idiot, and then he loses his job or he loses his reputation.
Ken,
It's
as
ridiculous.
you just cleared up by stating her net worth, I don't think 2 weeks is going to kill her. By the way, there's another bit of news happened just while we're on the topic.
Then what was the point?
Now-
So the point was, let me interrupt you because you interrupted me. The point is that the person who suspended her, the head of that organization, whatever channel it was, is virtue signaling, saying, see, my Jewish friends, don't get upset. I'm going to take her off for 2 weeks. It's going to be very upsetting to her. It's all crap. It's all a bunch of crap. It's all bullshit. All sides. All sides full of shit. It's bullshit.
All right, Ken. All right. We should let everybody speak, even if they're neo-Nazis.
Let him speak. Let him talk. What's wrong?
But the fact is, it's another piece of news here, peripheral to it, but sort of on the same topic, is Mel Marmelstein died.
Who?
Now, Mel Marmelstein. Now,
what is that? What does that got to do with anything in this universe?
Well,
Who's Mel
in
Marmelstein?
your universe, Ken, nothing has anything to do with anything.
Mel
But the fact is,
Marmelstein.
Mel Marmelstein was a survivor of the camps who actually won a lawsuit against Holocaust deniers. A very pivotal lawsuit against Holocaust deniers. When was that? I forgot when that was, Jim. I think it was in the 70s.
I honestly forget. I mean, I know you're talking about, this is when they actually started to clean them out. I would think it's in the 80s, but anyway, I could be wrong. Maybe, Alex, you could check that as we're talking.
How do you spell it?
Go on. Well, the one...
It's actually Mermelstein.
Well, the one thing I wanted to point out...
There's a statue to him in Brooklyn and Bella.
No, they actually made him film a
sure.
TV movie about it with Leonard Nimoy playing Mel Mermelstein.
Oh, really? Spock.
Fame.
He's a well-known figure, and this was an important case because the decision of the case was that the Holocaust, according to the United States courts, the United States justice system, the Holocaust was a fact. So Holocaust denial actually goes against the law.
It was.
It
started in '79.
All right. Well, look. I interviewed many liberators of concentration camps when they were younger, and they're as old as I am right now. They're in their 70s. I liberated many of them. I interviewed many of them. And the one who stood out to me was the company commander of the infantry company that first went into Dachau. Big, tall guy, about 6'4". And I asked him what happened, and then I just sat on the phone, and he went on a monologue for 50 minutes straight. 50 minutes straight. And his infantry company, when they came in and discovered what they saw in Dachau, they lined up 60 SS guards and shot them out of hand.
They shot them.
Shot them out of hand.
Yep.
And for years, I had the internal investigation of this, which was considered by some a war crime. What happened was the battalion commander was told, hey, go home, just get the hell out of Europe. We're going to bury this. And I held that investigation for years. I still have it because, it's the kind of thing that Holocaust deniers would have, cream in their pants to see. Because, oh my God, here was an example of Americans killing and committing a war crime against SS troops, which, as far as I'm concerned, good riddance. And, so the Holocaust to me, just in Pacifica, for example, we just having a big fight over a show in Pacifica that Kenny knows. They had a show that they didn't listen to, and the person decided who they were interviewing was from the Institute of Historical Review. And the person then goes, well, I saw 2 pictures of people coming out of Dachau, and I think it was a rest camp, right? That didn't go over too well in Berkeley. So they took that show off the air. And then, of course, I've been confronted with that recently by the Democratic Socialists of America, who are now bringing it up as an issue like, why can't this show be taken up? We're talking about Guns and Butter, Alec.
Right.
Kenny. And, and I said, wait a second, like, you act like, people haven't visited this stuff before. It amazes me how I've had these kind of examples of this kind of situation in Pacifica for 30 years. 30 years. Anyway, let's move on to another topic. Alex, Kenny, do you have something you want to share with us in terms of a news story before we move to Alex? Yeah. And you're listening to Going Viral News. We've just been talking about the Ukraine. We've been talking about Whoopi Goldberg. And now we're going to see what Kenny has to offer us as a story to talk about.
Let me very quickly slip in the word Cosby. I saw the first hour of that documentary. It's fantastic.
Oh, really?
It's shocking and highly recommended.
Really? Okay. Ken, you're muted if you're trying.
It's true. Someone told me about it today. What's that, on Netflix or HBO?
It's HBO.
Okay, good. I'll look for it. Kenny, you want to share what you're doing?
No, I just found this unusual article about Mali and France. So let me just pull that up a second. 1 second.
Yeah, that's it.
All right.
Let me get this. And just because this is something we never talk about. So there it is.
And you're listening to Going Viral News. I guess we're going to be talking in a few minutes about an Amnesty International report.
Right, but let's go through this Mali thing.
Anyway.
I hope you can hear it.
Go on.
You got it?
No, don't see anything.
No, really?
Yep.
Okay, 1 second. Oh, I see why. Now I see what the problem is.
And you're listening to Going here we go. Oh, yes.
It gives Paris's ambassador to the country just 72 hours to leave. Relations have been frayed since Mali's army first seized power in 2020. Also, after a 3-year freeze, Rwanda starts letting in truckers over its border with Uganda, but the restrictions still stand for the majority of traffic. Traders who've seen business suffer are desperate for the normalization of fraught relations between the neighbors. And the people's horse streaks to victory. Comedy Ding, a favorite for the 2022 Cape Town Met, delivers, as he should. The name really does rise to a challenge. It means bring it on, and he did. But first, Mali is expelling the French ambassador after what it says were hostile and insulting comments about its transitional government. It's the latest in an escalation of tensions between Mali and former colonial power France. The crisis could put into question a French-led anti-terror military operation in Mali, as Selena Sykes reports.
The announcement was made on national television and signaled the latest escalation in tensions between France and Mali.
The French ambassador in Bamako, His Excellency Joel Mayer, has been summoned by the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. During this exchange, he was told about the decision taken by the government to ask him to leave the country within 72 hours.
Bamako said the decision to expel France's ambassador was in response to, quote, hostile and insulting comments made by the French Foreign Affairs Minister. Jean-Yves Le Drian last week condemned the forced withdrawal of Danish troops, part of a joint European mission to fight jihadism in the region.
It's a new sign of recklessness. This junta is illegitimate and it's taking irresponsible measures.
His words, in turn, prompted a strong response from his Malian counterpart.
Insults aren't proof of greatness. We are willing to discuss with France or others on serious matters. This isn't about being irresponsible. What we are trying to do is defend the interests of our country.
Relations between Mali and former colonial power France have soured since the army staged a second military coup in May last year. Another source of tensions is the presence of Russia's Wagner Group in Mali. Paris had previously said any deployment of Wagner mercenaries would be incompatible with its own mission. 3 weeks ago, after the junta said it would postpone elections, West Africa's economic bloc ECOWAS slapped Mali with tough sanctions, including border closures and a trade embargo. The move sparked mass protests in the Sahel country. Many in the streets held anti-France and anti-ECOWAS signs.
An ECOWAS delegation met with ousted Burkinabe President Roch-Marc Kaboré on Monday and has reported that he is well. The MPSR military junta that took over the country is led by Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Demiba. On Monday, they declared him the president and removed the Army Chief of Staff and head of the National Intelligence Agency. The constitution has been reinstated except for any parts that contradict a new charter. Meanwhile, the crisis has led to a suspension of the long-awaited trial of 14 people charged over the killing of leftist leader Thomas Sankara back in 1987. His family says that proceedings may restart this week. Truck drivers have been allowed over Rwanda's border with Uganda for the first time in a 3-year.
Okay, that's the thing about Mali. The other thing was about the racehorse and the trucks. But the only thing I know about Mali is I love the music. You know, I can't even remember the names of the artists, but it's just wonderful music. So I'm leaning on you people to fill me in on all this intrigue and conflict and politics and scandals and economics going on between France, Mali, and they mentioned Russian troops.
All right, let me lead off. Let me lead off on that. First of all, there is the Wagner Group. There's a report that's been done by investigative journalists in Europe, how the Wagner Group is being recalled from Africa to the Ukraine. So lengthy investigation was done by a independent journalistic consortium that showed TikTok, Instagram photos, Facebook pictures showing elements of the Wagner Group deploying back to the Ukraine. Now, another question that comes out of this is that one cannot see just what's happening in Mali. There have been in the past 18 months military coups in Mali, Chad, Guinea, which is adjacent to Mali, Sudan, and now Burkina Faso, which is also adjacent or in the same area of West Africa as Mali. And now people are worried that there's going to be a coup d'etat in Niger, which is involved in the fighting with Boko Haram. So, and Mali, Guinea, and Burkina Faso all are adjacent to each other, as is Chad and Sudan. So there's a problem of actually, and I think there's been a coup attempt. Oh yeah, there was a.
I have a clip on that, Jim.
Well, there's a coup attempt in what, Guinea-Bissau?
Guinea-Bissau, yeah.
Which was put
failed.
down.
Yeah.
And that was a former Portuguese colony. So you have right now in Africa about 114 million people who are ruled by military juntas that have been established by coup d'etats in the past couple of years. Actually, this year, 4 successful coup d'etats. And so the question is, why are they happening? And people give all sorts of explanations. They all have Islamic insurgencies. There is various local tensions and grievances. There's millions of dead millions of people have been displaced in these countries, and there's incredible class differences. They will blame the civilian elites, the politicians, who seemingly don't care about their plight for their condition right now. ECOWAS is the sort of economic, it's basically the economic organization of West African states. And so its power is essentially limited in putting up any power to prevent them from doing anything. And we've seen these big, huge demonstrations back and forth. In some cases in Guinea, when they overthrew the government, there was great popular support for it. So the question is that, people then are saying, well, maybe it's better to take a strongman who can better deal with security risks than it is to just allow a, quote, democracy, if you will, take power. And people are afraid that this spate of coup d'etats is going to encourage other nations or other militaries in the region to do the same thing. So, but go on, Alex, your comments on this. Alex?
Jim, could you repeat the names of the countries that had the coup d'etats? I got a map up there now.
Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Chad, and Sudan. And they fear that there's going to be
Guinea-Bissau today. Yeah.
Guinea-Bissau was today. That's on the coast of West Africa. Niger is next to Libya, Algeria, and Boko Haram is operating in Niger.
Yeah. And of course, there was in Chad, their president was killed in the fighting some months ago. So, yes, there's, of course, all the so-called Francophone Africa. France, operates militarily in this area. Of course, they have their kind of neo-colonial aspirations, and they certainly play an important role. There's, and as, not as bad as, say, like the Congo, but there are, multinational corporations who have interest. There's the U.S., of course, U.S. AFRICOM operates everywhere. Although I think they kind of defer a little bit to the French, since the French have obviously the language connection, the more central, they operate their military more directly. But again, as Jim said, of course, there's the Russians and Wagner Group who,
Who's sponsoring these coups?
Well, no, they're internal.
Well, that's where you No, see, the problem is that when you get to the UN Security Council level, China and Russia have vetoed any attempt to have international sanctions on these various regimes. For example, in Mali, the Russians and Chinese voted together to nix sanctions imposed by the United Nations on the people who just took power in Mali. Because remember, there's been a whole series of coups in Mali. In fact, they kicked the French out. They kicked the French military out. So, so all these are very problematic, and they occur in the context of global rivalry between the West, the United States in particular, and Russia and China.
So these are proxy event.
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't say that because I wouldn't completely say that.
I mean, I haven't heard any evidence of like, the CIA did this or the Russians.
No,
did
well,
this.
they could be. Yeah, it could be. Well, look, West Africa is filled. Africa was a playground for the international intelligence agencies of NATO in the 50s and 60s, in particular. A playground, a literal playground. And I would also put the intelligence services of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact in that realm too. There used to be a division of foreign aid when they went in there. Basically, the Germans would take over the training of intelligence. East Germans would take over the training of intelligence agencies inside the countries that were aligned with the Soviet Union. And then, of course, the CIA, MI6, and SCDCE went crazy. They went crazy in that period of time. They had multilateral covert operations and cooperation throughout Western, Eastern, and Central and Southern Africa. Okay, this was SOP. I helped write a book about this stuff a long time ago. So this is a pretty it's been further documented with declassification of documents recently. So again, remember, Africa by the end of the century is supposed to be the highest growth rate of population in the world, more than China. So this is a volatile situation to have these kinds of situations happening, and they're due to class inequities, which can be exploited by foreign powers. But the militaries in these countries have their own histories that are very much integrated locally, and of course connected to the formal imperial powers those militaries come from, which in this case, in all these cases, are France, and Chad is France, Sudan is England, but that is long transformed in terms of the evolution of military. So yeah, it's a very interesting situation going on in Africa. Alex, you have a piece on this, on Guinea?
Yeah, let me put it up. So this is from France 24. This is one of these things where there's like several different pieces, so we don't have to play the whole thing. Oh, and let me.
Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, at least 11 people were reportedly killed in the coup attempt in Guinea-Bissau. A major investigations launched into the armed attack on the president and government buildings. Also, dozens of displaced people are killed in a machete attack on a camp in DR Congo. Kudeka militia from the Lendo community has been blamed for the bloodshed. And Guinea-Conakry's coup last September led the US to exclude it from the African Growth and Opportunities Act that gives members important tariff-free access to the US market. The decisions hit Guinean artisans who counted on the export to the American market hard. But first, at least 11 people were reportedly killed during a foiled attempt to overthrow Guinea-Bissau's president on Tuesday. Umaro Sissoco Embalo survived the coup bid, but details remain sketchy. The government says that military intelligence has started an investigation. Claire Rush has more.
A failed coup and an assassination attempt. That's how Guinea-Bissau's president Umaro Sissoco Embalo has described Tuesday's assault.
J'étais en plein conseil des ministres. Donc, tous les membres du Parlement, y compris le Premier ministre, nous sommes attaqués avec des armements très lourds, 5 heures de temps. Et en ce moment, tout c'est sous contrôle. Quand j'étais élu président de la République, j'avais avec deux choses, la corruption et le narcotrafic. Et ça, c'est lié aussi à ça. Et je savais quel était le prix de la lutte contre.
Several people were killed during the incident, including assailants and security forces, according to local media. While it remains unclear who carried out the attack, Embalo has suggested it may be linked to drug traffickers. The country has been through 4 military coups since 1974, and the latest attempt has come as a disappointment to some.
I felt very, very bad with this coup attempt because it will have future consequences for the country.
We know that Guinea-Bissau has gone through several coups. Each coup has its own path and negative aspects. At this moment, just surviving a coup attempt means that you have to wait 15 to 20 years to look for development of the country.
ECOWAS, meanwhile, has suggested the army was responsible for Tuesday's unrest. In a tweet on Wednesday, its commission president described the attack as a military coup. Embalo's presidency got off to a chaotic start in 2020 after his election win was contested by the runner-up candidate on allegations of fraud. West Africa has been hit by a string of coups over the past 18 months in Mali, Guinea, and most recently in Burkina Faso. ECOWAS is set to hold an emergency summit in the Ghanaian capital, Accra, on Thursday.
In DR Congo, dozens of people have been killed in an attack.
So it's interesting, that possibility that this could be the military, could be drug dealers, depending on who you ask. So be interesting if it was drug dealers, because I had heard that they were, brings to mind, things like what was going on in Colombia in the 80s with, Pablo Escobar's war against
Alex, you going to put up another piece?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, here, so let's get into the amnesty thing. Will you guys rather have Mehdi Hassan talking about, or we have Amnesty International itself? They did, a thing explaining.
That's like a 90-minute.
But probably Mehdi Hassan is more interesting. Yeah.
They go on and on and on and on.
Yeah. So Mehdi
I'm producing something. I deserve my paycheck.
So here we go. It's Mehdi Hassan. I forget what his program
is. This
Hassan.
guy. Yeah.
In a scathing new report, Amnesty International accuses Israel of committing the crime of apartheid.
This is one-sided. I watched this. It's one-sided.
And against Palestinian refugees. The 274-page report, a product of 4 years of work, research, and on-the-ground reporting,
he doesn't talk about the missiles
a system
from
of oppression
Hamas
and domination over Palestinians wherever it exercises control over the enjoyment of their rights across Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, and with regard to Palestinian refugees. The segregation is conducted in a systematic and highly institutionalized manner through laws, policies, and practices, all intended to prevent Palestinians from claiming and enjoying equal rights to Jewish Israelis within Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, and thus intended to oppress and dominate the Palestinian people. Strong words. But multiple Israeli leaders, in fact, including former Prime Ministers Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert, have warned in the past that Israel was on a path towards apartheid. John Kerry once did as well. But anytime the A word is mentioned, people lose their minds. South Africa is immediately invoked. Defenders of Israel say it's ludicrous to compare Israel to South Africa. Israel is nothing like apartheid-era South Africa, they say. There are two problems with that argument. First, as Amnesty International itself preemptively points out, this report does not seek to argue that or assess whether any system of oppression and domination as perpetrated in Israel and the occupied territories is, for instance, the same or analogous to the system of segregation, oppression, and domination as perpetrated in South Africa between 1948 and 1994. Instead, this report analyzes the systematic discrimination currently perpetrated by Israel against Palestinians and determines whether it meets the international definition of apartheid. See, what people don't seem to get is that Israel doesn't have to be a replica of South Africa. Apartheid isn't defined by what happened in South Africa, it's defined by international law. For example, in the 1973 International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid, quote, apartheid is defined as, quote, inhuman acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them. That's what the world's leading human rights groups are now saying is happening on the ground in Israel and the occupied territories. And they say it meets the definition of the crime of apartheid under international law. The second point about South Africa is that, I'm sorry to say, a lot of leading South African anti-apartheid activists, like the late Desmond Tutu, who recently passed away, thought there were similarities between apartheid in South Africa and apartheid in Israel. Have a listen.
You said that what you saw in Israel, something that was quite akin to the situation in South Africa before freedom came to the black people of South Africa.
Well, in many instances, worse. It's actually quite distressing. For one thing, we didn't have a war.
And he's not the only South African to say that. Sadly, the reaction from the Israeli government and its defenders abroad to this new Amnesty report has been as predictable as it has been disingenuous. An Israeli Foreign Ministry spokesperson accused Amnesty of recycling lies, inconsistencies, and unfounded assertions that originate from well-known anti-Israel hate organizations. Pro-Israel groups here in the US, like the ADL, AIPAC.
Can you pause this for a second?
They all put out ridiculous statements accusing Amnesty.
What do you want to say, Ken? You're muted, Ken. You muted yourself.
Yeah, I'm unmuted myself. This guy is very opinionated. His terminology, he says, unfortunately, and this and that doesn't matter, and this
he's
and
British
that.
trained,
No. He's prejudiced. He's already got his mind made up. He said, unfortunately, they disagree, and so forth. And these people say that it is. And he's just doing one side of an issue. That's all. It's okay to watch it, freedom of speech, but he's already decided. It's not a report.
Yeah.
He's not a journalist.
Mehdi Hassan, he has his opinion on the Palestinian crisis.
Yeah, I've seen him on many times. I've seen him many times. He's opinionated. He's not a journalist.
Alex, can I ask you a question?
Oh, you can be opinionated and a journalist.
Alex, this is an op-ed piece, okay? Did you present yesterday? Because I wasn't here yesterday, or do you have a new?
I just had a short thing on this from Al Jazeera, stating what the report said. It was 2 minutes, so that didn't have this. This has a bit more on what the report actually says.
Yesterday. All right.
Yeah.
Why don't we hear what Steve has to say on this issue? Steve?
Yeah.
Well, but this is an op-ed piece entitled to do as what we used to call an op-ed piece. But the fact is, you're not presenting us. There are.
Well, again, Ken didn't. I can play what Amnesty International.
There are certain aspects of the report that are in there. In the app, there's certain information that's in there, but it's mixed in with a lot of opinion about it, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with his opinion. I'm just trying to see if you've got an actual just straight news.
Oh no, yeah. No, I
had a friend who was born in the kibbutz. It's right on the border with Egypt. The one that was attacked initially by the Egyptian army when they invaded in 1948. He was born afterwards. He served as a paratrooper in the Israeli army on the West Bank. He fought in the October War. He fought in the War of Attrition. Then he came to the United States. He then did movies about, and he basically spent his first tour chasing the PLO on the West Bank. All right, that radicalized him. He became a very important distributor of all sorts of movies on the Middle East. He organized the first Middle East Film Festival ever organized in New York City at the Bleecker Street Cinema in, I believe it was 1979 or 78. Now, what did he conclude from this experience and what has been painful for him his whole life as he confronted this? And he did many other films about the Israel-Palestine conflict. He concluded that indeed, unfortunately for him and other people I know who also had similar combat experiences, they felt indeed they were defending a system that was akin to apartheid. Now, to me, this is not a revelation. This is not a new fact. Years ago, the PLO had a joint conference with the African National Congress in 1970, where they were seeking international recognition on this very point. Now, so one can talk about whatever explanation they have about the settler policy on the West Bank and all the impositions of all the controls on Palestinians since the Six-Day War, but I don't think it is such a disturbing fact to compare it to the legal system of apartheid in South Africa that was instituted after 1948 by the nationalist government when they took power. But let me hear what Steve has to say.
Well, wait, hold it. Jim.
Michael, let me hear what
Jim,
Steve has to say.
that wasn't my question. My question was, do we have a straight news story on this?
I think, look, Mehdi Hassan, he's an Oxonian. He loves to argue. If you ever seen him in action, he just loves to argue. And this show has had Mehdi Hassan argue with people defending Israel. We, if you recall, we had aspects of Intelligence Squared when Otis was involved with us, where we actually played Mehdi Hassan, who loves to fight. He's a great debater. He's a very pugilistic debater.
But the idea is,
you're saying the question objectively, is he an objective journalist if he decides to assert, based on an analysis of the legal framework of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, that indeed it could be interpreted as akin to what happened in South Africa?
No, I disagree. But people disagree. Mike's question is there an objective viewpoint, someone who's not interested, who's just reporting facts, data?
Oh, come on. There's on this issue, who? You got to bring in a space alien.
Excuse me. When you write a news story, there are certain criteria in writing a news story as opposed to an op-ed piece. Alex, I know you don't know anything about journalism, so let me explain some very basic facts.
Cut the insults. Cut the insults.
The idea is that there's a difference between a news story and an op-ed piece. There is nothing illegitimate about an op-ed piece. I am asking if they had a news story based on the who, what, the who, what, where, when, and how.
We did it yesterday, Mike.
Michael, he's doing a news story based on the release by the Amnesty International of this report on Israel.
Right.
But this isn't the news.
We did the news story yesterday, Mike, and you weren't here. So
what? Well, that's what I asked you.
No. My thing is this. The event is the release of the report from Amnesty International, and then the politicians' reactions to it in the U.S. and Israel and other organizations. Okay, and I don't know what The Rock has to say about it, or Sylvester Stallone, but I'm sure that's important too. But the issue is, I'm saying he's got a prejudicial viewpoint about the report.
All right.
He's not saying. Some people say it's correct. Some people say it's exaggerated. Some people say this, that, and the other thing. He says, no, unfortunately, these politicians objected to it like they always do. So he's prejudiced. He's not covering the topic of the release of this report.
Well, I would not expect anything less from him, frankly.
Okay, great. So
that's forget it. I mean, if you're asking for Mehdi Hassan to be neutral about something like this, Forget it.
That's not what he does. I got it.
Yeah,
Right.
forget it. But see, that's usually the argument. See, the problem with this is that how do we objectively assess the policies that have been instituted ever since the creation of the state of Israel towards the Palestinians and the Israeli area?
I have to interrupt you. I have misinformation. I've got fake news. I was told that there were Arabs, Muslims, who were elected to the Knesset.
They are.
I was told that there's an Arab party.
There are.
Is that apartheid?
Well, one can look at it in all different ways, and of course they do thrive in it. But they have a whole history separate from the Palestinians on the West Bank.
Okay, but that's not what other people are saying. The report says Arabs in Israel and in the West Bank are suffering apartheid. It doesn't say Arabs in the West Bank are suffering apartheid.
And they include Palestinians in Israel because they also there's a separate legal system for them where they do not have full rights.
All right, let me hear what Steve has to say about all this. Steve Jonas, what do you have to say?
I would rather hear Steve.
Yeah, let's Steve. What do you have to say about?
I know Steve has written some articles about.
All right, go on, Steve.
I sent around a paper which to the group which you probably didn't get a chance to read. Which
I did, Steve.
Pardon? Who did?
I did.
Oh, thank you. Thanks very much.
I enjoyed it.
Also, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, I won't go into into all the details or very many of the details of the articles. There has been a major wing in Israeli politics and pre-Israel politics from the very beginning. From the 1920s. It was founded by a man named Zev Jabotinsky. And he very clearly advocated expelling all the Arabs who were living in the Mandate from what became the State of Israel and the West Bank. There are literal descendants of Jabotinsky and his people in the government up until Netanyahu. Netanyahu was a son of a man who was one of Jabotinsky's right hand men, and the Stern Gang and the other major terrorist organization in the Mandate before 1948 were also they became major Israeli politicians. So that there has been this certainly an expulsionist, whether you want to call it apartheid or not, and I'm not going to argue about that one, but there's certainly expulsionism of the Arabs from the Mandate territory, not just the present state of Israel, has been part of a major wing of Israeli politics since the 1920s. Opposing that is a statement that I would like to read for you, which actually hangs on the wall of my study. The state of Israel will be open to Jewish immigration and the ingathering of exiles. It will devote itself to developing the land for the good of all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisioned by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. This statement is found in the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel in 1948, and I will stop there.
Okay.
Well, actually, Steve, yes, I did read your article, and that basically says that is, as far as I'm concerned, that is the definition of Zionism. That is part of the definition of Zionism. The Jabotinskys and certainly the Stern Gang was considered.
And they're good.
You have to remember that Ben Gurion actually considered having military action against the Stern Gang.
Yes.
And the Irgunists themselves, the Stern Gang was a breakaway group from the Irgun, which again, you might say was a breakaway group from mainstream Zionism. So, I mean, they only started they got power when Begin got in. That was really when they got power in the Israeli government.
He had been a leader of the Stern Gang.
Well, Begin wasn't part of the Stern Gang. He was in the Irgun.
Oh, Irgun, okay.
But
well, that's right.
The Stern Gang is. I don't think ever anybody from the Stern Gang actually got into power. But
yeah, the very short guy who was prime minister, probably in the 1970s was a Stern Gang. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
Michael, just as a corrective, they did fight. They did fight.
Shamir was, yeah.
They did fight, yes.
Yeah, they did fight over the Altalena ship.
Right.
And so that was a fight directly between the Haganah and the Irgun and the Stern Gang, a direct combat, frankly, because they were trying to fight against the unification of the Israeli army after the first ceasefire into what became, because they did not like the fact that the Labor Party dominated the Haganah and the Palmach. So they had a fight. They fought over that ship, which contained weapons. But go on, Mike.
Yeah. So it basically went to a civil war there. But the Jabotinsky idea did not get into mainstream Israeli politics for a long time. The fact is that now what they're basically fighting for is, you might say the Jabotinskys are trying to hijack the idea of Zionism, or the definition of Zionism, which is not the definition of Zionism, as Steve, you correctly said, was in the Israeli Declaration of Independence. So, so the fact is, Israel, which I always felt should have a written constitution, which would probably clear up all of this stuff. They should have had it from the beginning. One could say that about Great Britain also, but the fact is that what you have here is you have politicians, starting with Begin, and you had Shamir, and obviously Sharon, and obviously Netanyahu. You have politicians who are more Jabotinsky oriented, if not excessively Jabotinsky oriented. And what they're doing is they are attempting to move Israel away from its own Declaration of Independence and its own standards. Now, within Israel itself, first of all, I don't even think at this point, they hold a majority of opinion. When Israel is under siege, they tend to coalesce against the oppressors. So when everybody's coming down against Israel, yeah, then they're gonna coalesce, as any country would, when it feels like it's quote unquote under siege. But the fact is that I would say that a majority of the Israeli population, as majority of the Israeli Jewish population, does not adhere to the Jabotinsky manifest. Not only doesn't adhere it, but they're probably definitely against it. So what has to, in other words,
right, Mike, Michael, you have to get your understanding of political Zionism in Israel after 1948 a little more nuanced. To argue that it's true that there's a great split in the body politic of Israel about these kind of issues. And we just saw the compromise candidate come out of the battles that they had. But I think, and also I would contest the idea that during the 50s, these ideas of revisionism were not there. They were there, and they were always vying and in contestation with the Labor Party. We know the Labor Party dominated the policies until after the Six-Day War, and particularly after the October War. That was the key division point after the October War. But they always were there, and part of the look at what happened when the first settlers come on the West Bank. They sit there and present Yigal Yadin, a fait accompli. They present a fait accompli to Yigal Yadin, and he says, well, okay, like these guys decided to, claim what they see as a Eretz Israel, after the success of the 6-Day War, and then they present them with a fait accompli. And what does the Labor Party do? They compromise with it. Yigal Allon creates a policy that essentially begins what we now see as the West Bank settler movement in its full prime. So, I just think that if we're going to talk about political Zionism, we got to sort of like.
How does that disagree with what I was saying?
It does disagree, because I think you made a comment earlier in your comment about, essentially saying that the Revisionist Party was not a political force in Israel in the 50s.
No, I didn't say
totally
that. I
disagree with
said that they were not.
Well, you did.
They were not the main political force.
I agree with that.
In other
But
words,
but the Labor, the point is the Labor Party adopted the same policies. The Kibbutzniks were not exactly, they were left-wing political Zionists. Anyway, let's bring Dennis in. Dennis, your comments about all this. Dennis,
unmute.
And as we all know, we can argue about this for hours.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, Dennis, go on.
I think personally, I think there's no doubt that Israel is an apartheid state. And it's a settler colonialism. They took over somebody else's land. It's the same thing as the U.S. took over Indian lands. We're settler colonial system. And the U.S., as far as that Jabotinsky is concerned, before Mussolini was had a pact with Hitler, he had his group was trained by the Mussolini's Navy, the fascist Navy. So I would consider Jabotinsky a fascist. And I would consider a lot of what goes on in Israel as fascism. And I think it's time to call it what it is.
A couple of quick notes. In the 1930s, Ben Gurion characterized Jabotinsky as the Jewish Hitler. The statement that I read before came right out of the original Constitution of the State of Israel, which still is the Constitution of the State of Israel. Of course, that paragraph has been completely ignored. As far as there ever could possibly be a constitution for the State of Israel, my dad used to say, my dad knew a lot about this and was very active, as I say, in fighting anti-Semitism in the 1930s and 40s, and also in the beginning supporting the creation of the State of Israel. My dad used to say, can you just imagine a group of Jewish leaders getting together in a room and sitting down and agreeing on a constitution? Are you kidding me?
Well, I should add the Leahy group. Okay, let's get further in the weeds on this. The Stern gang, Avraham Stern, had a journal. Look, I spent years. I mean, the first thing I ever wrote about was the stuff in the 70s. The October War, all these things about the Arab-Israeli conflicts, and the Stern gang in their publications, they referred to Jews as a master race. And they referred to Arabs as a nation of slaves, and that they felt that there should be mass expulsion of all Arabs from Palestine and Transjordan, and some even called for their physical annihilation. So that was the Leahy group that formed the Stern gang. They were fascist, radical, right-wing folks that were indeed the Italian intelligence services took them over and trained them. I think it was not necessarily the Italian Navy. I know that that what's his face,
Begin.
I think Begin actually was trained by them, but they received training. They received training.
Begin and Shamir.
Right, Shamir. They received training in Sitavachenia, which is where the fascists had an engineering school. They trained them, and then they were trained by the Poles. The Polish armed forces trained them too. So, that was how the Stern Gang got military training. They got it in Europe from the fascists and the right-wing Poles. But anyway, this is all interesting, and again, maybe we could devote an entire show to fight about this.
There's another facet we should, when we actually do talk about this some other point, which is that since we were talking about the Holocaust, the idea is that there is still in the minds, correctly or incorrectly, among many people in Israel and many people outside of Israel, which is the idea of and since there have been certain Arab governments, administrations of Arab countries in the region, which call for the annihilation of every man, woman, and child in Israel, the specter of the threat of genocide and annihilation is a factor in the thinking. In other words, it makes it harder to have to sit down and have a totally rational evaluation of what's going on within Israel if they feel that they're faced with a threat. And let's remember also that a lot of the more extreme anti-Israel groups have their roots in the Nazi Party, in Nazism. They were heavily influenced. So the fact is
all right.
Concern.
All right. I would go even further than that, and actually this is a good opportunity. There's an Israeli journalist, Gershom Gorenberg, who's written some very good books he actually wrote a book on the first settlers after the 6-Day War. But Gershom, we've been playing phone tag throughout the pandemic. He did a book about the intelligence wars in the Middle East during World War II. And one of the things that I found interesting, he emphasized, was how the Lehi, in other words, the group of the Stern Gang, they proposed to the Nazis in 1940 that they wanted an alliance with Nazi Germany. Now, the Leahy group proposed an alliance with Nazi Germany. Now, the argument was that they would rebel against the British and then Germany would recognize an independent Jewish state. Now, the problem sometimes with the anti-Zionist Jews on the left is that they then conflate these kind of particular aspects of, frankly, the tragedy of people responding to the omnipotence of Nazi power in Europe. And they conflate this and then generalize and say, well, of course, don't you understand that the Zionists were going to align themselves with the Nazis? And, and I remember having fights at WBI with individuals who would argue that kind of crap and not understand the limitations of this, because when you compare it to the policy of the Labor Party, forget about it. These are sort of interesting and important issues to talk about, because they were trying to respond to what they were seeing in Europe, and they were taking a initial rebellious point of view to the McDonald paper of 1939, which essentially froze immigration into Israel. All right. That was a very, and Steve knows this because he grew up with this in his background as a child. And then the Labor Party decided to align, the leadership of the Yishuv decided to align itself. They had no choice to align themselves with the Allies in World War II. And then, of course, you had the formation of the Jewish Brigade. You had, the kind of training that guys like Yitzhak Rabin got when he was in the Palmach. They were trained. They actually, if you know, the Palmach, they were trained, and he lost his eye in the invasion of Syria in 1941. That's when he was wounded. So there's that aspect of it. But then during the war, the Leahy group, the Stern Gang, they decide to embark on a campaign of terror against the British. After the Germans, of course, what, you want to align with us in 1940? So, I mean, and that's my critique of the people on the left, because even Rashid Alidi, who's a scholar of this, he never defends this kind of bullshit. He always says that the Holocaust was responsible for what happens after the war. So I personally think that this is an issue that, certainly deserves an entire show to talk about or argue about. But people got to come in prepared for war here, because I'm going to have a no take no prisoners aspect on this shit, because you start getting my memory going about this. I'm pretty familiar with this stuff, and I spent like years and years reading about it, interesting, because it was fascinating. But these are the terrible origins of the Arab-Israeli conflict. I would also add that during the war itself, the amount of military trained Jewish manpower exceeded there was almost 100,000 military trained personnel that either went through the British Army or had fought in different other armies, and they came back and were nascent in forming the state of Israel's army before the Declaration of Independence. And what happened in Egypt? Egypt was suppressed because the British were afraid of a revolt. All the other armies around it were suppressed due to the invasion of Lebanon and Syria. Iraq was invaded. Their army was repressed in 1941 by the British. All these armies around them were essentially, they had literally nothing to equivalent of military trained manpower, except, of course, the Jordanian Legion. But, that's what happened in 1948. And again, it was a near run thing. But, anyway, we can certainly explore this another time. But anyway, Michael, you want to say?
With that, I'm going to take my leave, gentlemen.
No, the only thing is,
I will
take
be
it
back
easy,
with you
Steve.
next week.
Thank you so
We're
much.
closing down. Thank you, Steve.
You're welcome. Thank
Anyway,
you.
Michael, do you?
And actually, we could explore the fact that why those militaries, the Egyptian, Lebanese, Syrian militaries, were suppressed by Britain. Was it because, and it gets very complicated, was it because, though, in part of their alliance or alliances with Nazi Germany?
Well, remember, you had somebody like who was assassinated, Anwar Sadat. He was imprisoned during the war because he had a relationship. He was in prison because he was one of the Egyptian officers who was collaborating and communicating with the Axis, and so he was viewed as a threat. That's why getting this guy Gershom Gurenberg for a different event would be very interesting, because that is his bag. He has a tremendous knowledge about this. And remember, they also had an Einsatzgruppe in the Afrika Korps ready to start exterminating Jews in Palestine if they had actually occupied Palestine. And again, you had the collaboration of Palestinian nationalists, such as the Grand Mufti, with the Nazis. And he organized the Muslims inside the former, Yugoslavia, to fight against the partisans, and that was a legion. He had a legion that was of Palestinians that were trained by the Nazis. So, and some people on the left deny that. They just ignore that completely. So to me, it's sort of ridiculous, like, let's take the kind of stuff that sort of doesn't fit our narrative and eliminate it from discussion, which the left is famous for. Yeah. Anyway.
Okay, we got that on tape, Jim. Okay. All right, so you want to bring the show to an end here? I wanted to play something.
Yeah, go on.
Let me just play 2 minutes or something, and then I'll cut it off and you'll end the show.
Okay.
From Mali. I don't know what it's playing, but it's always good. Very unusual instruments. Okay, back to you, Jim.
Yeah, that was a kora. Those West African music is absolutely African music is absolutely gorgeous and beautiful around the whole continent. Anyway, you've been listening to the Going Viral show on Wednesday, February 2nd, and I want to thank everybody for listening. We had Steve Jonas on. Playthel Benjamin actually tried to get on. He had a problem with his internet, so eventually we'll see good old Playthel. And we had Alex Stavropoulos, Mike Jankowitz, Dennis Goldstein, and of course Ken Aaron in California, Los Angeles, near those wildfires, near the San Andreas Fault, all these places. But anyway, we want to thank everybody and stay tuned.